The sun lay burning with a 40 degrees Celsius fever and called his father again and again. No answer. His father was busy organizing his mistress's birthday party. Hours later, he finally came home to a silent, empty house. No wife, no child, just divorce papers waiting on the table. Every account frozen, every asset locked. And when reality hit, he dropped to his knees, begging, but it was already too late. The fever had climbed so fast it frightened him. 40 degrees. The kind that makes skin burn and thoughts blur. The kind that leaves a child whimpering for reassurance, even when they're old enough to know better. The son lay curled on the bed, phone clutched in his damp hand, pressing redial again and again. Each ring felt longer than the last. Each unanswered call deepened the panic settling in his chest. He wasn't calling to complain. He wasn't calling to be dramatic. He was calling because his body felt wrong, because the room spun when he tried to sit up, because his mother wasn't home and the only person he trusted to make it stop wasn't answering. Across the city, his father's phone buzzed on a banquet table beside half-inflated balloons and pastel-wrapped gift boxes. He glanced at the screen once, frowned, and flipped it face down. He told himself he'd call back later. He always did. There was time. There was always time. Tonight mattered. The restaurant had to be perfect. The cake had the wrong frosting shade and needed fixing. The florist was late. His mistress's birthday had to feel special, unforgettable. He was already behind schedule, already irritated, already justifying his silence with excuses that came too easily. Kids get fevers, he thought. It's fine. I'll deal with it later. Later never came. By the time he finally walked through the front door hours later, his laughter from the party still echoing in his ears, the house felt wrong immediately. Too quiet. Too hollow. The lights were off. No television murmuring in the background. No familiar sounds of movement. No soft chaos of a lived-in home. He called out his wife's name casually at first, distracted, already scrolling through photos from the party on his phone. No answer. He called again, louder this time. Still nothing. That was when he noticed it. The emptiness wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. The hallway closet stood open, hangers bare. Family photos were gone from the walls, leaving pale rectangles behind like scars. The kitchen counter was clean in a way it never was, stripped of the small messes that marked everyday life. Even the spare change bowl by the door was empty. A slow, cold understanding crept up his spine. He walked into the living room and saw the envelope. White, centered, waiting. His name printed neatly on the front. Divorce papers. His breath caught as he tore it open, scanning words that refused to soften no matter how many times he blinked. Custody terms. Financial injunctions. Dates. Signatures. Everything already filed. Everything already in motion. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't an argument starter. It was an ending. His phone buzzed then, sharply, almost mockingly. A bank notification. Then another. Then another. Accounts frozen. Joint assets locked. Cards declined. He tried to log into his financial apps. Fingers shaking now, panic fully awake. Error messages stacked one after another. Access restricted. Temporary holds. Legal review. No, he whispered, the word tearing out of him. He ran down the hallway, throwing open doors. The bedroom was bare. Drawers empty. Closets hollow. The child's room, stripped down to nothing but a mattress and a forgotten toy in the corner. His heart slammed painfully against his ribs as the full weight of it crashed down. She hadn't just left. She had prepared, and she had taken everything that mattered. He dropped to his knees in the middle of the living room, the envelope slipping from his hands. His mind scrambled desperately for control, for leverage, for a way to undo what had already been done. He called her, straight to voicemail. Again, voicemail. Again. He texted. Nothing. He called his son's phone. No answer. That was when the fear sharpened into something colder than panic. Something that tasted like guilt. He remembered the missed calls. The fever he'd brushed aside. The phone he turned face down so it wouldn't interrupt the party. The way he'd laughed while his child lay burning alone, waiting. For the first time that night, the story he'd been telling himself cracked. This wasn't about one mistake, or one affair, or one bad night. This was the consequence of 1,000 small decisions where he had chosen himself over everyone else and assumed they would still be there when he turned back. He sobbed then, openly, humiliatingly, clutching the papers as if they might dissolve if he held them tight enough. He begged aloud, though no one was there to hear it. Promises spilled from his mouth, empty, frantic, far too late. What he didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning, because while he was falling apart on the living room floor, she was already somewhere safe, already with their son, already watching a fever break under proper care, already steps ahead, calm, resolved, unmoved by the sound of a man finally realizing what he had lost. And unlike him, she wasn't begging anymore. What he didn't understand, kneeling on the living room floor surrounded by emptiness, was that none of this had been impulsive. The house hadn't emptied itself in a few frantic hours. The accounts hadn't frozen by accident. The divorce papers hadn't materialized out of anger or spite. The real ending had begun weeks earlier, quietly, while he was busy convincing himself everything was under control. She had noticed the pattern long before she named it. The missed calls that were never returned until it was convenient. The promises that dissolved the moment something more exciting appeared. The way emergencies in their home were treated as inconveniences, while emergencies elsewhere were handled with urgency and devotion. At first, she told herself it was stress, work pressure, temporary distraction. Everyone goes through phases, she reasoned. Good marriages survive worse. Then the nights grew longer. The lies grew smoother, and the silence grew heavier. The first time their son spiked a high fever months earlier, she had rushed him to the doctor alone while his father texted apologies from a work meeting that later showed up tagged on social media at a hotel bar. She didn't confront him that night. She tucked their child into bed, watched his breathing steady, and felt something inside her quietly recalibrate. Love doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes. She started paying attention after that, not in a paranoid way, in a deliberate one. She noticed how often she was the only parent present, how often decisions fell on her shoulders by default, how easily he delegated responsibility without asking, and how confidently he assumed she would absorb the fallout. The affair wasn't discovered through dramatic evidence. There was no lipstick on collars, no late-night whispers overheard behind doors. It revealed itself through neglect, through the way he was suddenly unavailable during moments that mattered most, through the energy he poured elsewhere while rationing scraps at home. The birthday party had been the final confirmation, not the cause. When she learned he was planning something elaborate while brushing off their son's worsening condition, something inside her went still. Not angry, focused. Rage makes noise. Resolve is silent. She sat beside her child, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead, listening to his labored breathing, and understood with brutal clarity that she was alone in this marriage. That night, while he fussed over decorations and menus, she made calls of her own. Not emotional ones, practical ones. A lawyer she'd consulted quietly weeks earlier. A financial advisor who already had copies of documents she'd gathered methodically. She had learned, painfully, that love does not protect you from legal reality. Preparation does. She packed efficiently. Not everything, only what mattered. Clothes, documents, medication, her son's favorite blanket, the small framed photo he kept by his bed. She left behind things that could be replaced. She took what couldn't. Before leaving, she walked through the house one last time. Not to reminisce, to confirm. This was no longer a home. It was a structure where she and her child were expected to exist on standby while someone else lived fully elsewhere. She didn't cry then. She drove straight to the hospital. The doctors took one look at her son and moved quickly. For fluids, monitoring, care, real care. As she sat beside his bed, listening to machines hum steadily, she felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Relief. Not because everything was okay, but because she had acted. Her phone buzzed repeatedly in her bag. She didn't check it. She already knew who it would be and why. For once, she didn't need answers. She had them. By the time the fever began to break, the paperwork was already filed. Temporary orders granted. Assets frozen to prevent retaliation. Custody provisions established based on documented patterns of neglect. None of it had been rushed. Every step had been calculated to protect her child first and herself second. When he finally came home hours later to a hollow house, he believed she had snapped. That grief and jealousy had driven her to extremes. What he couldn't accept was that this was the result of patience finally running out, of a woman who had waited, hoped, communicated, and adjusted until there was nothing left to adjust without breaking herself. The begging that followed didn't reach her, not because she was unreachable, but because she had already heard every version of it before. Promises made too late sound identical to lies told too early. She wasn't interested in apologies that only surfaced once consequences arrived. As she watched her son sleep peacefully at last, colors slowly returning to his face, she felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only certainty. She had chosen correctly. She had chosen safety over familiarity, action over hope, reality over excuses. The man kneeling on the living room floor believed this night was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. He didn't yet understand that for her, it was the first night in a long time where fear had finally loosened its grip. She wasn't running away. She was walking forward, and she would not be coming back. The night stretched on endlessly after she left. Once the initial shock wore off, panic took its place, sharp and relentless. He paced the living room, stepping over empty spaces where furniture used to sit, as if movement alone could undo what had already happened. Every object missing felt like an accusation. Every bare wall echoed with the sound of his own neglect. He tried calling her again, then her sister, her mother, anyone who might force her to answer. Each attempt ended the same way. Silence. That silence was unbearable because it didn't argue back. It didn't give him something to fight against. It simply existed, immovable, final. He convinced himself there must be a mistake. Accounts don't just freeze, he thought. Lawyers don't just file overnight. Wives don't just disappear. Not like this. Not without warning. His mind scrambled to rewrite the narrative into something manageable. A misunderstanding, a dramatic gesture, a scare tactic. But the documents in his hand told a different story. As the hours crawled toward morning, reality began to seep in through the cracks of denial. The divorce filing was airtight. Dates, exhibits, timelines. Evidence he hadn't known existed. Missed medical appointments. Text messages unanswered during emergencies. Travel records that overlapped too conveniently with his absences at home. She hadn't just left emotionally. She had documented everything. He sank onto the couch, head in his hands, replaying the past months with painful clarity. The moments he dismissed as harmless. The times he'd told himself he deserved happiness, deserved escape, deserved something more exciting than responsibility. He believed love would wait. That family would remain intact by default. It hadn't. When dawn finally crept through the windows, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't her. It was the bank, then his lawyer, then his workplace. The ripple effect had begun. Word traveled quickly when legal and financial structures shifted overnight. Meetings were canceled, accounts flagged, questions raised. He felt exposed, stripped of the illusion that he could compartmentalize his life without consequence. The affair had been hidden behind charm and excuses, the neglect masked by confidence. But systems don't respond to charm. They respond to facts. He drove to the hospital in a daze, clutching hope like a lifeline. Surely she'd be there. Surely seeing his son would soften her resolve. Surely this could still be fixed. When he arrived, the nurse stopped him at the desk. "You're not authorized," she said gently. The words hit harder than any accusation could have. Not authorized. He stood there, stunned, as she explained visitation restrictions and temporary custody orders. He nodded mechanically, barely hearing her, the weight of it pressing down until his knees threatened to give out again. He asked about his son's condition. Stable, improving, receiving excellent care. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, followed swiftly by something colder. He hadn't been there. Others had stepped in where he had failed. He sat alone in the waiting area for hours, staring at the floor, surrounded by strangers who looked nothing like him but felt impossibly distant. For the first time in a long time, he had nothing to distract himself with. No party to plan, no messages to send, no one to impress, just consequences. By the time he left the hospital, the sun was high and the city was fully awake. Life moved on around him with cruel indifference. Cars honked. People laughed. Somewhere, a birthday celebration probably continued without him. The irony wasn't lost. He returned to the empty house and collapsed onto the floor again, this time not from shock, but from exhaustion. The kind that comes when the truth finally settles in and there's nowhere left to run. He had lost more than his wife. He had lost access, trust, control. He had lost the assumption that things would always reset in his favor. And for the first time, he understood something terrifying. She wasn't coming back to negotiate. She had already decided. For the first 2 days, he still believed this was leverage, a move meant to scare him into compliance, into remorse, into obedience. He told himself she would calm down, that once the fever passed, once emotions settled, she would answer. He clung to that belief because the alternative was unbearable. The alternative meant accepting that he no longer mattered in the way he had assumed he always would. On the 3rd day, that belief finally collapsed. It happened in the most ordinary way possible, not through a dramatic confrontation or a cruel message. It happened when he sat across from his lawyer, watching a man who had no emotional investment in his marriage read through documents with professional detachment. "This isn't a bluff," the lawyer said flatly. "Your wife didn't just prepare. She executed." That word landed hard. Executed. He leaned forward, palms sweating, and asked what that meant exactly. The lawyer explained calmly. Temporary injunctions in place. Emergency custody granted based on medical neglect risk. Asset freezes legally justified to prevent dissipation. The filings were clean, thorough, and devastatingly precise. Whoever had advised her had done so well. She anticipated retaliation, the lawyer continued, and she protected against it. The room felt smaller suddenly. He asked if he could contest it, slow it down, reverse anything. The answer was careful, measured, and deeply unsatisfying. Not quickly, not without consequences, not without evidence he didn't have. For the first time since that night, he felt something close to fear that wasn't self-pity. This wasn't anger directed at him. It wasn't punishment. It was removal, and removal doesn't negotiate. He drove home in silence, replaying the lawyer's words over and over. She anticipated retaliation. He had never imagined himself as someone who needed to be protected against. That realization cut deeper than any accusation. It meant she had already accepted that he might lash out once control was taken from him. That she had prepared not because she hated him, but because she no longer trusted him. That night, he sat alone in the house again, staring at the divorce papers with new eyes. He noticed details he had skimmed past before. The dates, the documentation. The language was firm but unemotional. No insults, no dramatics, just facts. Facts don't argue. They conclude. He thought about the fever again, about the missed calls, about the phone he'd turned face down so it wouldn't interrupt the party. That memory no longer felt distant or abstract. It felt sharp and present, replaying itself relentlessly. He imagined his son lying there alone, scared, burning, waiting. The image made his chest ache in a way apologies never could relieve. It dawned on him then that this hadn't been one bad night. It had been the final night in a pattern that had gone on too long. She hadn't left because of the affair alone. She had left because the affair had confirmed something she already knew. That when it truly mattered, she and their child were not his priority. The next morning, he woke up early for the first time in months, not because he had somewhere to be, but because sleep had abandoned him. He wandered through the house slowly, opening drawers, closets, cabinets, not looking for anything specific, just confronting the reality of what remained. What remained was very little. He tried reaching out again, this time through his parents, through mutual friends, through people he hoped might soften her stance. The responses were polite but firm. She wasn't taking calls. Communication would go through legal channels. The boundary was clear, and it held. That was when he finally understood this wasn't a threat. Threats are loud. They demand response. They wait for reaction. This was quiet, structured, finished. She wasn't waiting for him to beg better or promise harder. She wasn't testing his loyalty or remorse. She had already moved past the stage where his reactions mattered. That realization broke something inside him. He sat on the edge of the bed that no longer smelled like her shampoo and whispered apologies to an empty room. He promised change to no one. He vowed devotion with no audience. The words sounded hollow even to him, because deep down he knew something else now. If she had wanted him to understand, she would have argued. If she had wanted reconciliation, she would have left room for it. She hadn't. She had chosen safety over hope, action over waiting, finality over possibility. And that choice, once made, could not be undone by begging. As the day wore on, the weight of it settled fully into his body. The house wasn't empty because she was angry. It was empty because she was done. Done trusting. Done explaining. Done believing things would change just because he said they would. He realized then that the worst part wasn't losing her. It was realizing she had already let go long before he noticed. If he had been honest with himself, he would have known this wasn't the moment she left. That moment had come long before the fever, before the empty house, before the divorce papers waiting like a verdict on the table. She had left quietly, invisibly, in stages he hadn't noticed because nothing had demanded his attention at the time. She left the first time she realized she no longer trusted him to show up when it mattered. That realization didn't come with shouting or tears. It came one afternoon in a doctor's office months earlier, when she sat alone holding their son's hand while the nurse asked where his father was. She had smiled politely and said he was working, even though she knew he wasn't. As she answered questions and signed forms, something inside her recalibrated. She felt it distinctly, like a line being crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Trust doesn't shatter loudly. Sometimes it simply withdraws. She left again the night she found the receipts. They weren't dramatic either, just small things that didn't align. A hotel charge when he'd said he was at a conference. A restaurant bill on a night he'd claimed exhaustion. A pattern that became undeniable once she stopped looking away. She didn't confront him then, not because she was afraid, but because she was paying attention. Anger clouds judgment. Observation sharpens it. Each time she chose not to confront him immediately, she was choosing clarity over chaos. She left again when she realized he no longer saw their child's needs as urgent unless they interfered with his plans. The fever incident wasn't the first. It was just the one that stripped away every excuse at once. She had watched him deprioritize, rationalize, and deflect responsibility so many times that she no longer needed proof. She had a pattern. Patterns don't lie. The night of the party, while he debated frosting colors and playlists, she sat in the dim light of their son's room, counting breaths and watching sweat bead along his hairline. She had already packed the essentials earlier that day. Not emotionally, practically. She had already made peace with the fact that if she didn't act, nothing would change. What he never understood was that her calm wasn't indifference. It was certainty. Certainty born of exhaustion, of trying every reasonable version of patience, of lowering expectations until there was nothing left to lower. Certainty that the life she was holding together would eventually break something inside her if she didn't intervene. She didn't leave to punish him. She left to preserve herself and her child. By the time he knelt on the living room floor begging, she had already mourned the marriage. She had cried weeks earlier, quietly, when no one could see. She had grieved the version of him she thought she married, the version of the family she believed they were building. When people cry after leaving, it looks dramatic. When they cry before leaving, it looks invisible. That invisibility fooled him. He believed the begging might still reach her because he assumed she was reacting emotionally. He didn't understand that emotion had already run its course. What remained was resolve. Resolve is immovable. As days passed and the legal process moved forward, she stayed focused on routine. Doctor's appointments, medication schedules, school notifications, stability. She understood something he didn't. Children don't need parents who beg. They need parents who act. She refused to let chaos define the next chapter of her son's life. When he tried to rewrite the story later, Framing himself as blindsided, she didn't correct it. People who claim blindness often ignored warning signs deliberately. She had given him chances wrapped in calm conversations, in gentle reminders, in moments of vulnerability he hadn't taken seriously because they didn't threaten him at the time. The affair wasn't what ended the marriage. The abandonment was. The abandonment of responsibility, of presence, of prioritization. By the time the fever hit 40 degrees, the choice had already been made. The fever simply removed the last excuse. It forced her hand, not because she was desperate, but because she was done waiting for him to choose differently. She never looked back after leaving the hospital that night. Not because she was heartless, but because turning back would have required her to pretend nothing had changed. And pretending is a luxury you lose once clarity arrives. He would spend months telling himself he could have fixed it if he'd known how serious she was. That if she had just told him plainly, he would have changed. That story comforted him because it preserved his self-image. But the truth was simpler and harder. She had told him, in every ignored call, every handled crisis, every time she showed up alone. He just hadn't been listening. And by the time he finally heard her silence, it was no longer an invitation. It was an answer. What he lost that night went far beyond the woman who walked out the door or the child no longer sleeping down the hall. He lost the version of himself that still believed he could outrun consequences with charm and excuses. He lost the illusion that love was elastic, endlessly forgiving, capable of snapping back in a place no matter how much strain he put on it. And once those illusions were gone, there was nothing left to cushion the fall. In the weeks that followed, he moved through his days like a ghost haunting a life that no longer belonged to him. Friends stopped calling as frequently. Invitations dried up. The same people who had laughed with him at the party now looked uncomfortable in his presence, unsure of which version of the story to believe and unwilling to get involved. Social circles have a way of rearranging themselves once accountability enters the room. He told his side of the story often at first. He framed it as a misunderstanding, as a moment blown out of proportion. He emphasized stress, poor timing, bad luck. What he avoided were specifics. Specifics don't bend easily. Specifics expose patterns. And patterns were exactly what had undone him. At work, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. He was distracted, less confident. The ease he once carried himself with had evaporated. He had built his professional image on control, on the assumption that his personal life was stable and supportive. Now that foundation had cracked, and it showed. Missed deadlines, short tempers, careless mistakes. People noticed. They always do. He tried to distract himself at first, the way he always had. Nights out, new connections, temporary escapes. But distraction lost its power when there was nothing solid to return to. Pleasure without grounding feels hollow. Every empty morning that followed only amplified what he had lost. He began therapy reluctantly, not out of reflection, but out of desperation. The first sessions were defensive. He spoke about betrayal, about being blindsided, about how unfair it all felt. The therapist listened patiently, asking questions he didn't like answering. Questions about responsibility, about patterns, about why his needs had always come first without him ever naming them as such. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to see it. Not fully, not all at once, but enough to feel the weight of it. He hadn't just lost his family. He had lost the structure that had made his life work. The quiet labor he'd never acknowledged. The emotional scaffolding that had allowed him to take risks elsewhere without fear of collapse. Once that scaffolding was removed, everything felt unstable. He thought about his son constantly, about the fever, about the unanswered calls, about how easily he had dismissed them in favor of something that now felt absurdly trivial. Birthdays come every year. Trust doesn't. The hardest realization wasn't that he'd made mistakes. It was that he had been warned. Repeatedly, calmly, without drama. And because those warnings didn't threaten him immediately, he had ignored them. He had mistaken silence for acceptance, endurance for consent. Now, that silence had teeth. He tried writing letters he never sent. Long apologies filled with insight he wished he'd had earlier. He promised change. growth, presence. But each letter ended the same way, folded and placed in a drawer. He knew better than to send them. Words after the fact feel like bargaining, and bargaining only makes sense when the other person is still undecided. She wasn't. Meanwhile, she rebuilt quietly, not dramatically, not with announcements or declarations. She focused on stability, routine, creating a sense of safety for her son that didn't depend on unpredictability. She didn't speak badly of his father. She didn't need to. Children understand consistency far better than explanations. That contrast haunted him. She had moved forward while he remained stuck, circling the same regrets, replaying the same moments, searching for a version of events where he could still be the hero. That version didn't exist. He began to understand something uncomfortable. What she had done wasn't cruel. It was decisive. And decisiveness feels cruel only to those who benefited from indecision. He had assumed love would wait. That forgiveness would arrive on demand. That being needed meant being irreplaceable. The night he came home to an empty house shattered those assumptions permanently. What he lost wasn't just a family. He lost the privilege of being careless. And that loss would follow him far longer than any legal battle or financial setback ever could. While he remained trapped in replay and regret, she moved forward with quiet determination. Not out of bitterness, not out of a desire to prove anything, but because standing still had never protected her before. Forward was the only direction that made sense now. The first weeks were focused entirely on her son. Follow-up appointments, adjusted schedules, gentle routines designed to restore a sense of normalcy after fear had entered his world too early. She watched him closely, not with panic, but with attentiveness. Children recover faster when they feel safe. She made safety her priority. She didn't talk much about what happened. Not to neighbors, not to friends. She resisted the urge to justify herself or explain the decision in detail. Those who mattered understood without being told. Those who didn't were not her concern. She had learned that clarity doesn't require consensus. The legal process unfolded steadily. No dramatic hearings. No emotional outbursts. Everything proceeded exactly as planned, because planning had been done long before emotion took over. When her lawyer updated her, she listened carefully, asked precise questions, and made decisions without hesitation. She was calm not because this was easy, but because she was no longer uncertain. At night, after her son fell asleep, she allowed herself moments of reflection. She grieved the marriage she had hoped for, not the one she had lived in. She grieved the version of her child's life that included two present parents under one roof. That grief was real, and she didn't rush past it. But she didn't let it dictate her future either. She noticed how different her days felt without constant disappointment hovering in the background. There was less tension in her body, fewer sharp spikes of anxiety. Even exhaustion felt cleaner now, untainted by resentment. She was tired because she was doing the work, not because she was carrying someone else's neglect. Friends stepped in quietly. School pickups, meals left at the door, offers made without pressure. Support that respected her boundaries rather than demanding emotional access. She accepted what helped and declined what didn't. That discernment felt new, but empowering. She also noticed how her confidence returned in subtle ways. She trusted her judgment. She trusted her instincts. She no longer second-guessed decisions or waited for validation. The choice she had made, difficult as it was, had proven she could rely on herself under pressure. That knowledge reshaped how she approached everything else. There were moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly. A song, a place, a familiar routine. She let those moments pass without attaching stories to them. Healing, she understood now, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about integrating it without letting it control her. She didn't check his social media. She didn't ask mutual friends for updates. Not out of spite, but because knowing would not change anything. Curiosity fades quickly when clarity is strong. Meanwhile, he remained anchored to what he had lost. He replayed conversations, imagined alternate endings, constructed scenarios where a single different choice might have saved everything. That backward gaze kept him suspended between regret and denial. She felt sympathy for him, but sympathy no longer required sacrifice. When their paths crossed briefly during a legal formality, she noticed how different he looked. Smaller somehow, less certain. The confidence he once carried had evaporated. She didn't feel satisfaction at that realization. She felt confirmation. The dynamic had shifted permanently. She spoke to him politely, briefly, and without emotion. That neutrality unsettled him more than anger ever could have. Anger invites engagement. Neutrality closes the door. Afterward, she returned to her car, hands steady on the wheel, and breathed deeply. She felt no urge to cry, no urge to scream, only a sense of finality that wrapped around her like armor. The life she was building wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defined by revenge or victory. It was defined by intention, by choices made deliberately rather than reactively, by a refusal to return to patterns that had already proven harmful. She didn't know exactly what the future would look like. She didn't need to. She knew enough. Enough to trust herself. Enough to protect her child. Enough to keep moving forward without looking back. And while he remained stuck in the echo of an empty house, she was already creating a new one. Not built on assumptions. Not held together by endurance. Built on presence. Built on action. Built on the certainty that some endings are not tragedies, but necessary corrections. There came a day when there was no one left to blame but himself. No narrative left to adjust. No friend left to reassure him that things would somehow work out. It arrived quietly, without ceremony, the way most truths do when they can no longer be avoided. It happened when the court date arrived. He had imagined it would be dramatic. Heated arguments, emotional testimony, a chance to plead his case directly, to explain himself, to be seen. Instead, it was procedural, efficient, impersonal. The judge reviewed documents, confirmed facts, and issued rulings with practiced neutrality. There was no stage for remorse, no space for last-minute redemption. She sat across the room, composed, focused, unreadable. Not cold, contained. The difference mattered. Coldness suggests anger. Containment suggests resolution. He felt the weight of that distinction settle heavily in his chest. When the custody terms were affirmed, he felt it physically. A tightening in his throat, a pressure behind his eyes. Supervised visitation, scheduled calls, conditions he had once believed applied to other people, other families. Not his, not them. And yet, here they were. He wanted to protest, to argue that he loved his son, that he had always loved his son. The truth of that love didn't matter in that moment. Love without reliability doesn't translate into trust. And trust is what the court required. As the proceedings continued, he noticed something else. She didn't look at him, not once. Her attention remained on the judge, on her lawyer, on the process. That absence of eye contact unsettled him more than anger would have. Anger implies unfinished business. This felt finished. When it was over, people stood, gathered papers, and left. No confrontation in the hallway. No emotional exchange. Just an ending confirmed by stamps and signatures. He watched her walk away with their son, hand in hand, calm and steady. The image burned itself into his memory. That was the moment he truly understood what consequences meant. Not punishment, not humiliation, loss of access. He returned to his car and sat there long after the parking lot had emptied. His phone remained silent. No one was checking in. No one was waiting for an update. He had spent years assuming he was indispensable. That assumption had quietly collapsed. In the weeks that followed, he attempted to rebuild some sense of normalcy. He cleaned the house. He restructured his schedule. He tried to focus on work. But everything felt provisional, temporary, like a life lived in draft form. Without the roles he had taken for granted, he didn't know who he was supposed to be. During supervised visits, he tried too hard. Gifts, apologies, overcompensation. His son responded politely but cautiously, mirroring the emotional safety he had learned from his mother. Children adapt quickly when consistency is provided elsewhere. Each visit ended the same way, with him standing alone, watching the car drive away, realizing that time didn't rewind simply because he wanted it to. Therapy sessions became quieter, less defensive, more reflective. He began to speak honestly, not to justify himself, but to understand how he had arrived here. That understanding didn't offer comfort, but it offered clarity. He had prioritized immediate gratification over long-term responsibility. He had assumed forgiveness was automatic. He had underestimated the cost of being absent when presence was required. Understanding didn't restore what he had lost. It simply explained it. Meanwhile, she continued to live her life without monitoring his progress. She didn't need updates. She didn't need proof of change. Change that arrives after consequences is rarely trusted. She focused instead on what she could control: stability, health, a future unburdened by unpredictability. She began to notice how people interacted with her differently now, with respect, with acknowledgement, with an understanding that she was someone who followed through. That reputation had been earned quietly, without announcements or displays. It followed her naturally. That contrast became impossible to ignore. One evening, after a particularly difficult visit, he returned home and stood in the doorway of his son's empty room. The silence pressed in on him, heavy and unyielding. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of it without deflection. He hadn't just lost a family. He had lost the chance to be who they needed when it mattered most. That loss couldn't be undone with promises or apologies. It could only be carried. And in that realization, painful as it was, something finally shifted. He stopped asking how to get his old life back and began, slowly, to understand that some lessons arrive only after everything else is gone. Time didn't heal everything, but it clarified it. The sharp edges dulled, not because the pain disappeared, but because it stopped fighting reality. For her, that clarity felt like strength settling into place, solid and dependable. She no longer braced herself for impact. Life wasn't ambushing her anymore. It moved at a pace she could anticipate, shape, and manage. She noticed how much lighter her body felt without constant tension. No more waiting for the other shoe to drop. No more scanning conversations for disappointment. No more measuring words carefully to avoid conflict that never led anywhere productive. Her nervous system finally rested. That rest became her foundation. She rebuilt trust slowly, starting with herself. Each decision she made and followed through on reinforced that trust. She said no without explanation. She said yes without guilt. She stopped negotiating with people who required her discomfort as proof of loyalty. Those small acts accumulated into something powerful. Her son thrived into predictability. His laughter returned easily. His sleep deepened. The fever episode faded into memory, replaced by routines that prioritized health and safety. He learned, without being told, what consistency looked like. Children learn from patterns, not speeches. And the pattern now was clear. She never spoke badly of his father. Not because she wanted to protect him, but because she wanted to protect her son. There's a difference. She answered questions honestly, but simply, without emotional charge. Over time, the questions came less frequently. Stability answers many things without words. People sometimes mistook her calm for forgiveness. She didn't correct them. Forgiveness wasn't the point. Detachment was. She had released the need to carry resentment, not to absolve him, but to free herself. That distinction mattered. Meanwhile, he struggled with the absence of permission. He had spent years operating under the assumption that someone else would absorb the fallout of his choices. Now, there was no buffer, no soft landing. He had to face consequences without translation or mitigation. That alone changed him more than lectures ever could. She watched that transformation from a distance, uninterested in overseeing it. Growth that requires an audience rarely lasts. If he changed, it would have to be for himself. Her role in that chapter was finished. She filled her life with intention, work that engaged her, friendships that reciprocated, moments of joy that didn't depend on escape. She didn't chase happiness. She built conditions where peace could exist. Happiness followed naturally. The strength she carried now didn't announce itself. It didn't seek validation. It simply showed up consistently, in choices aligned with values rather than fear. She no longer asked for permission to prioritize herself and her child. She didn't need approval to protect what mattered. One afternoon, while watching her son play, she felt a quiet sense of pride, not in surviving, but in choosing, in recognizing the moment when endurance turned into harm and having the courage to stop. That courage had reshaped everything. She understood now that love without accountability is unsustainable. That presence matters more than promises. That safety is the foundation upon which everything else stands. Those lessons would guide her long after the pain faded. As the sun dipped low and the day softened into evening, she felt grounded. Not triumphant, not vindicated, grounded. That grounding was her victory. And while the world continued on, indifferent and loud, she stood firmly in a life that finally felt honest. There was a day when he realized something else had slipped beyond his reach. Not custody, not money, not reputation, but the story itself. For a long time, he had believed that if he could just explain his side well enough, if he could frame events in a way that made sense to others, he could still control how everything was understood. That illusion dissolved quietly, the same way everything else had. It happened when someone asked him about the divorce and didn't wait for his answer. They nodded politely, as if they already knew enough, as if the details no longer mattered. That was when it hit him. The story had settled. Not in his favor, not against him, just settled. People had drawn their conclusions based on patterns they'd observed, not excuses they were offered. No amount of explanation could shift that now. Meanwhile, she never told the story at all. She didn't correct rumors. She didn't offer her version. She didn't defend herself. She let her actions speak instead, trusting that consistency would do what explanations never could. And it did. Over time, the narrative shaped itself around what people could see. A stable child, a calm mother, a life that functioned without drama. That contrast was impossible to ignore. He began to understand that stories belong to those who live well after the ending, not those who argue about it. She had moved on in a way that didn't require justification. He was still trying to be understood. During one of the supervised visits, his son said something small that changed everything. He mentioned how things were quiet at home now. Not boring, not sad, just quiet, safe, predictable. The word landed with more weight than any accusation could have. Quiet meant no emergencies ignored, no raised voices, no waiting. Quiet meant presence. He smiled and nodded, but the realization stayed with him long after the visit ended. His child didn't miss chaos. He didn't miss apologies. He missed reliability. And reliability had come from the parent who acted, not the one who promised. That night, alone again, he stopped drafting messages he wouldn't send. He stopped rehearsing explanations no one had asked for. For the first time, he allowed the story to exist without his narration. It was humbling and necessary. For her, life continued to expand in ways she hadn't anticipated. Opportunities arose organically. People trusted her judgment. She was invited into spaces that valued steadiness over spectacle. None of it felt like compensation. It felt like alignment. She understood now that when you stop carrying someone else's chaos, you make room for your own clarity. That clarity attracts stability the way confusion attracts conflict. The past no longer demanded processing. It had been processed through action. The future didn't feel intimidating because she had proven to herself that she could navigate uncertainty with decisiveness and care. The story was no longer about betrayal or abandonment. It was about boundaries, about recognizing the moment when love becomes unsafe, about choosing a different ending even when it costs you everything familiar. He would always remember the night he came home to an empty house. She would remember it too, but not as a loss, as a turning point. And the story, now complete, belonged not to the one who begged at the end, but to the one who had the courage to leave before begging became the only option. There was a moment weeks later when he realized he had finally run out of ways to insert himself into her life. Not dramatically, not through a final rejection, simply through absence. The messages he no longer sent, the calls he no longer made because he knew exactly how they would end. Silence had replaced effort, not out of anger, but out of acceptance. At first, that silence felt like defeat, like erasure. He had spent so long believing that persistence would eventually be rewarded, that showing up enough times would reopen doors that had closed. But some doors don't close slowly. They lock. And once locked, they don't respond to knocking. They respond to time. He tried focusing on himself in earnest for the first time. Not as a performance, not as a strategy, but because there was nothing else left to do. He adjusted his routines, forced himself into healthier habits, confronted parts of his character he'd avoided for years. It was uncomfortable, humbling work, and it came far too late to save what he'd lost. What surprised him was how little of this growth intersected with her life now. She didn't monitor it. She didn't comment on it. She didn't reward it with softened boundaries or renewed access. Growth, he learned, isn't a bargaining chip. It's a responsibility. He saw glimpses of her future from a distance. Not through updates or conversations, but through outcomes. Her son doing well, her stability evident, her life functioning smoothly without him. Those glimpses hurt more than confrontation ever could have. They confirmed what he'd feared most. She didn't need him anymore. And that was the consequence he hadn't prepared for. He had assumed being needed was permanent, that even if he failed temporarily, his role would always be available to reclaim. But she had restructured her world in a way that didn't require his participation. She had designed a future that no longer accounted for interruption. That realization shifted something in him permanently. He stopped imagining reconciliation, stopped picturing scenarios where timing or apology could restore what had been lost. He began to understand that her decision wasn't a reaction to pain. It was a commitment to safety. And safety, once established, is rarely surrendered. Meanwhile, she continued living in alignment with that commitment. She didn't avoid places they used to go. She didn't shrink her life to accommodate history. She reclaimed spaces without drama, memory by memory, choosing which ones to keep and which to release. Healing wasn't loud. It was methodical. Her son grew into the rhythm of this new life with remarkable ease. Children adapt to consistency quickly. What adults label as loss, children often experience as relief when chaos is removed. He learned routines. He learned trust. He learned that when he called, someone answered. That knowledge shaped him more than any explanation ever could. She watched him grow with quiet pride. Not pride in herself, but pride in the environment she had created. An environment where care was predictable, not conditional. Where attention wasn't competed for. Where love wasn't postponed. She didn't think about her ex often anymore. When she did, it wasn't with anger or longing. It was with a distant recognition that some people are meant to teach lessons rather than remain in your life. That understanding brought peace, not bitterness. For him, acceptance came slowly, painfully, but came. He learned that some consequences are not designed to be escaped. They're designed to be carried, to shape you, to prevent repetition. He would never again assume silence meant consent. He would never again mistake patience for tolerance. Those lessons had been paid for dearly. There were days when he wondered if she ever thought about him. The answer no longer mattered. What mattered was that she no longer had to. The future she was building had momentum now. Not frantic, not defensive. Steady, forward-moving. It didn't pause for nostalgia or regret. It didn't wait for closure conversations or final acknowledgments. It simply unfolded. And for the first time, he understood what real finality looked like. Not anger, not punishment, not even distance. Just a life that continues without you and doesn't look back. By the time the year turned, something subtle but irreversible had settled into place. The chaos was gone. The court dates were over. The emotional aftershocks had quieted. What remained wasn't triumph or bitterness. It was steadiness, a kind of emotional equilibrium that didn't demand acknowledgement to exist. She no longer measured time by what had happened or what might have been. Days weren't counted in before and after moments anymore. There were simply days filled with routines that worked and choices that felt aligned. That, more than anything else, told her she had done the right thing. There was no dramatic final confrontation. No last conversation where everything was said and understood. Real life rarely offers that kind of closure. Instead, closure arrived through repetition, through mornings that began calmly, through evenings that ended without tension, through a child who slept peacefully, unafraid of being left alone when he needed someone most. She understood now that revenge is loud because it still seeks connection. It wants the other person to feel something, to react, to acknowledge pain. What she had chosen instead was disconnection. Not coldness, but completion. She didn't need him to hurt in order to heal. She needed him out of the equation. That distinction mattered. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of him from afar, at a distance, in passing. He looked older, quieter, less certain. She felt no urge to approach, no desire to revisit old wounds. Compassion existed, but it was no longer actionable. It stayed where it belonged, internal, not expressed. Her son, now healthier and more secure, rarely mentioned his father unless prompted. Not because he didn't care, but because his daily life no longer revolved around absence. Children anchor themselves to what's present, and presence had become consistent. She never framed the story for him as good versus bad. She framed it as choices and consequences, as responsibility and care, as showing up when it matters. Over time, he absorbed those lessons naturally, without lectures or bitterness attached. For her, the biggest change was internal. She no longer felt the need to explain herself, not to friends, not to family, not even to herself. The decision spoke for itself. Every day she lived peacefully. That peace was evidence enough. She realized that the moment he chose to ignore a call about his child's health was the moment the marriage ended, even if the paperwork came later. Some decisions carry a weight that eclipses apologies. That night wasn't a mistake. It was a revelation, and revelations don't get undone. As the seasons shifted, she allowed herself to imagine a future without guarding against disappointment. Not recklessly, thoughtfully. She didn't rush into anything new. She didn't need to. Stability was no longer something she chased. It was something she maintained. She had learned that love must coexist with responsibility to survive. That attention is a form of care. That neglect, even when unintentional, leaves marks that don't fade easily. Those lessons would guide her choices going forward, quietly shaping a life built on awareness rather than hope alone. For him, life continued too, shaped by lessons he couldn't avoid. He would carry them into whatever came next. Whether they made him better was no longer her concern. Accountability, she understood, doesn't require supervision. The ending of their story didn't arrive with applause or outrage. It arrived with silence, with a door closed firmly and without hesitation, with a life that moved forward without checking behind itself. And that, she knew, was the most honest ending of all.